Grails application. I'm going to build a little sample, talk about it along the way, and we will see what we can do with it. Best time to ask questions, or if you have comments, is when you do. So don't hesitate, don't wait until the end. And if you do have a question or comment, in addition to raising your hand, just draw my attention. Sometimes if you raise your hand, I don't see you, and you think that I'm ignoring, but certainly the contrary. I can't just see. The lights are blinding a lot of times. So just raise your voice, draw my attention. I'll be more than happy to listen to you. Well, jQuery has kind of become the de facto standard over time. Of course, Angular is pushing its boundaries now. But I want to say one thing. This has been fascinating for me. If you had followed for several years now, at one point, prototype was the standard, if you even remember that. And everybody was using prototype. And then I'm trying to remember what was there before prototype. I can't even remember now. But then prototype was like a dominant library for a while, and almost every framework was using prototype. And then came along a time, everybody dropped the prototype and they went to jQuery. And now we are talking about maybe dropping that and moving to something else. So I have this theory. The library that's your darling today is the one you will hate in 2 years. And this has been a consistent way we have been doing things. We'll, for 2 to 3 years, that's what we will all use, and suddenly we'll just drop it and go to something else. But jQuery is pretty amazing to what it does in a number of ways. And what I'm going to talk about here is not just using jQuery, but how do we go about using it actually. So I'm going to show you 3 examples here: Ajaxing, selecting items, and animation. Let's talk about Ajaxing, but before we do that, let's look at a little example code we want to use. I have a very simple example here. I have tasks. And a task has a name, that's it, and uniqueness. You cannot have 2 tasks with the same name. Fair enough? That's it, right? Very simple. I have a controller. The controller list will list all the tasks in alphabetical order. Notice the alphabetical order. And create will return a new task. And save will save the task. And if the save worked fine, it redirects to list. If not, it tells you and puts you back in the create. Right? That's pretty much. And let's not worry about delete. So then we have a list GSP. It's just listing stuff. And all you see in this case is it's listing the values for this particular task. And create is going to let you create it. Very simple. Let's go back here and say Grails run app. I'm still using the older version of Grails here, but the concept should pretty much carry over to the newer version. So what you're going to do here in this case is, I'm going to run this code. I'm going to bring up over here, let's say a local host 8080, and I'm going to visit this particular application we are running. So let's go ahead and run this. So right about now. So there we go. And so I'm going to go to the controller, which is the task, and just take a look at what it does. So right about now, come on, you can do it. Oh, what's up here? So let's actually bring up the URL here. So it's running. So here's the local host. Maybe I mistyped it. Let's see. So let me open this up here, and we can see in this case, right, there is the app. You can see there are 3 tasks. Oh, I didn't show you where those tasks were. I put them in the bootstrap just as a sample data. I'm using in-memory database, right? So Ajax, delete, present, alphabetical order works. I go here, if I want to create something, I could go to the create, and I could ask him to create, let's say zebra, for just to see that it's in the bottom. You can see zebra is in the bottom. And I can go back and click on create one more time, and we can see in this case, I'm just creating, oh, let's say Alaska, and you can see that's right in the middle. So that seems to be working. But of course, what I want to do is I want to Ajax this particular application. But before we do that, I want to talk about how kind of Ajaxing can become complex. So I have a little file here called co.txt, which contains a few cities in Colorado. I've got another file here called tx.txt, which contains a few cities in Texas. And I also have a ca.txt, which contains a few cities in California. So, but I also have, so just a pure options in there. But I also have a file called states.html. And notice in the states.html, I have an on change, and I got cacotx. And of course, I have this little function called process. Let's go take a look at this. It's called states.html. So I go to this function called states.html, and I change the state, and all you see here is a little pop-up that says selector. So I want to write the code for it. Well, how would you typically write the code for this? You would first of all say var and xhr equals new XML HTTP request. Now this is one of the wonderful things that Microsoft did, is by providing us this kind of object that can do asynchronous calls, right? And what I want to do with this is I want to say xhr.send to send a request. But before I could send it, I want to tell him what to do. So xhr.open, and I want to perform a get request, so that's going to be a get. And then I can specify, in this particular case, what I'm interested in getting. Well, I'm going to say states file in here. Well, obvious question is what's states file? So I'm going to say var states file is equal to, well, the name of the app is called tasks. What is it called? Now I can't remember. So the name of the application is called tasks app. Okay, great. So tasks app, and then I'm going to specify a plus, the state name plus star .txt. So now that I've given that as the states file name, I'm going to make a request. Once I make a request, I'm going to say xhr dot ready state on ready state change equals a function. And within this function, I'm going to say, well, what should I say within this function? I'm going to say if xhr.ready state is equal to 4, that indicates that it is the response has come back, then I'm going to say alert xhr.response text. Let's just do that for a minute before we go any further. So if I go back here, refresh this page, go ahead and click on, let's say, CO. Hey, how wonderful, that popped up. But I really want to stick it back into where it belongs, that response. So I'm going to say document dot get element. So get element by ID. And in this case, the element I'm interested in is the cities, which you have up here. So to cities dot inner HTML equals, well, this is going to be xhr.response text that we just got. So if I go back here and refresh this and I change it to CO, you can see that's changing. And you can also see in this case, if I were to go back here and change it, you can see that's changing. So that seems to be working, isn't it? However, you can imagine what's going to happen. This was almost a trivial example. But even for this, we had to write this much code. And what you just saw, the fact that all the code worked as I wrote it, is called my lucky day. It doesn't usually work that way, right? Usually I would be sitting here and struggling, oh, what's the variable name? Did I make it wrong? Maybe I should just go buy lottos, right? There's a good day to buy lotto because things seem to work like that. But that's a lot of work, isn't it? And the more code we write like this, the more brittle it becomes, more complex it becomes. Life is not fun. So what do you want to do? Well, we want to, as much as possible, streamline this. So before we can streamline, we got to do some little bit more work. So what should I do to make this code Ajaxy? There are a couple of different things you have to do. So this is not as much about jQuery as how you would bend Grails to be able to do it, but jQuery kind of fits into it. So I'm going to do some initial steps here. The first thing I'm going to do is to go to create.jsp. Well, actually, let's go to list.jsp. And notice in the list we have a table. This table here is the table you're seeing right here. So task/list, that's the table you're seeing right in front of you. And for this table, I'm going to do a few things. The first thing is I'm going to say ID equals, and I will call it as task table or tasks table. I gave an ID for it, right? Task table, great. The next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab this values right here, just for a second. I'm going to go back and say, create in here, under the Grails app view task underscore display task.gsp. So I have created a file called displaytask.gsp. The file itself has an underscore in front of it. The underscore represents a template. So what I've done in this template is I put that content that will be repeated for every single element. and that's called the underscore displaytask.jsp. And I'm going to go back to the list, and I'm going to remove this part from here, and I'm going to simply say g:\render template is equal to display task without the underscore because it's understood, and then I'm going to say model is going to be equal to, and in this case, what's the model I'm interested in sending? Well, the model is going to be the task that we are interested in utilizing. So this is going to be a task which is going to be the value from the task itself. Now, of course, I got to figure out if it actually works. So to prove that it actually works or prove that it doesn't work, I'm going to put a few exclamations here so we can actually make sure that it's actually calling this version of the code. You can see the exclamations coming in. So again, that seems to have worked properly. So that tells us that we are using the template. Now, what did we achieve by doing this? The display task only displays one task at a time. But if you notice here, we are looping through each and asking it to print one of them at a time, and basically we said, go do these. What's the benefit of doing what I just did? Rather than having the list go through and print the data here, we put it into a separate one where every line is the file, which means when we create a new task, we can already get that one task alone as HTML, and so that becomes a little bit reusable code, right? So that's basically the reason we did that. But of course, I want to be able to create the task right here in the main, so what am I going to do? I'm going to go to the create, and I'm going to grab this form, and I'm going to go back to the table. Right above the table, I'm going to put that form. Well, we got one problem here. This is going to fail if I do this, run this. And the reason is, notice that this code requires tasks, and sure, we are getting the task. That's why this code worked a few minutes ago. But now notice this guy wants a task, not a task plural, a singular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the controller, and notice the create is creating a task, whereas a list is creating a tasks. So I'm going to say over here, task : new task, comma, and I'm going to return a bunch of tasks. So now that I made this change, our list now gets the tasks and also gets the new task. Both of those are available. So I go back to the code, I do a refresh here. You can see that smoothly sitting up here. But I really want an AJAX call, so I'm going to say form remote. And I'm going to change this to a form remote. So you can see that these two are form remotes. And what does form remote really do? All that it does is it produces the proper HTML necessary for it. Well, right now here it is in here, but it will come from another plugin, depending on the version of Grails you're using, but essentially it's a form remote you're calling here. So I'm going to go ahead and put it. But before I can use this, I got to do a little bit more work. We're going to start using jQuery. And form remote is using jQuery. So I'm going to use jQuery, but what do I do for that? Well, I'm going to first of all update the build config. Again, once again, if you're using a newer version, it will be a Gradle file. Older version, it will be a build config. But essentially, I'm going to come up with a configuration file here. And if you look at this file, jQuery, well, that was already there. I didn't have to do much work, so it's already there. But if it's not there, go ahead and add it. But then what you can also do here is go to main.jsp, and in the main.jsp, go to the resources and modify this to jQuery. So you have added jQuery into the mix, and so once you have added those two, you are ready to use the jQuery. But before you do that, I've got a small recommendation. When you are using these techniques, you are relying upon a number of things coming together. Now, when you rely on a number of things coming together, what normally happens? They don't come together. And you would write some code, and then you would run the application, and you would sit there and scratch your head, why doesn't this work? And it's very frustrating when this happens. But normally I recommend people slow down and go very methodical at this point. So notice the very first thing I'm going to do. Now that I've written this, it only takes just a minute to do this. You go and refresh the page, and once you refresh, in this case already it's complaining about form remote. Tell you what, let's not do that. Let's just go ahead and remove the form remote for a minute. We'll come back to that in a minute. So go back and refresh the page. That's the first step. That seems to work. But quickly bring up your view source. That only takes very little effort, right? Bring up your view source, and you see jQuery is there because we added that into the main. Click on it and make sure it's displaying. Just because you have a link doesn't mean it's right. So just by clicking and making sure it has the right link saves you so much effort moving forward. If you don't do this check and you try to put a pile of code, and then you're sitting there and scratching your head why it doesn't work, and 30 minutes later you're like, oh man, I did a typo over there, right? And it's a waste of time. It's not worth wasting that much time. Your productivity is important, right? Just verify. This also helps you to know that you know what you're doing, right? Great. Now that we have that in there, I'm going to put this form remote. What do I do in the form remote? I'm going to say URL equals, and I'm going to specify here is an action that I want to bring the save into. So that's my action. This also requires a name property, whatever you want to call it. I call it create. That's enough for now. So I've created a form remote. Now let's go back and refresh the page. You can see that worked. Once again, don't rush. Go to the view source, look for the form, and try to understand what the form is saying. Notice beautifully the form says, the form remote got translated to on submit, jQuery, Ajax, do a post request, data for jQuery, and blah, 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 the URL. And then it says, once you send that, do a post request to that URL save. Learning what this is doing is very helpful. And if you're using HTML5, you can see it's using the data, and so that all fits in. Here's a small note. The form remote will generate this output whether you included jQuery or not. It doesn't care. Because that's a Grails part that says, I'm going to spit this code. And that's the reason why you want to verify that you had the link for jQuery in place. Trust me, I have done that. I forgot to either include jQuery or I made a typo and I put a form remote, and guess what it does? It nicely put this and says, go ahead. And then you keep clicking like a stupid and it doesn't work still. Why? Well, you said jQuery, but you never said what jQuery really is, right? If it's Java or C++, C# or languages like that, you normally get a compilation error for using variables that were not undefined. Well, JavaScript wouldn't give you any of those, right? JavaScript, if it's undefined, it's undefined. It's going to just throw some fits at the console, and maybe you looked at it, you say, oh, why is jQuery not defined? That can be very frustrating. So that's why it's important for you to make sure it's included properly. Then you know that this is actually working, right? Okay, so we got the jQuery in place. That's great. What should I do now? Well, now I'm going to enter some data and click on it. Where is that going to go? It's going to go to the save, isn't it? So let's go to the save now. And in the save, well, okay, one more thing. Sorry. I need to do one more thing. I call this tasks table. But I'm going to go to the display task. And in the display task, I'm going to say ID equals, and I'm going to say task, and then little information about whatever the ID is, task.id. In fact, task 1, task 2, task 3, whatever it is going to be, I gave an ID called task and then task ID. Just keep that in mind. I gave an ID. Now I go back to the controller. In the save, rather than redirect to action list when it was successful, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to say define display task equals g:render, and I'm doing a rendering of what? Template, and the template I want to render is display task. And then I'm going to say model, and the model I want to send to this guy is task. So that gives us a display task. Now I'm going to say a render content type is going to be text/JSON. So I'm going to directly render a JSON from here from the controller. And what's the JSON that I'm going to render? So I'm going to say in here I have a task and the value for it is display task. So in other words, now that we created one task in the memory, in the database, I take that one task, create a HTML output for it right there, and then I push that HTML output as a JSON output to the client and say, you go, here's the Ajax response for you. So that's what I'm sending from here. Well, let's see if that works. So I'm going to hit the save button. Again, do one step at a time. If you do 30 steps, you got 30 problems to fix. If you do one step, you got one problem to fix. How do I have one problem to fix? What happens if you have 30 problems to fix? That's called running a daycare center, right? You got 30 children all beginning to cry at the same time. I don't know about you, but I cannot handle that. I'll go crazy, right? One kid crying itself is too much at any given time. You got 30 kids crying at the same time. You just say, I'm sorry, I'm calling in sick and leave, right? That's all you can do. That's kind of the way it feels when the code kind of starts, failing at the same time. So that's all we did. Now let's go back here, refresh this here, and see what it wants to tell us. And I refresh this, and I'm going to say, oh, let's call it test and click on create. Well, good news, it didn't blow up. Bad news, it didn't do anything either. But what is the result? What are we seeing? So here's another idea. Bring up your console. Your console is a really good friend in the browser. So bring up the console, because a console is chatty. It tells you certain things for you. In this case, I'm not going to go to the console. I'm going to go to the network. So notice the network is quiet right now. And what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to go back here and say test1, and I click on create. Right there it says save, a green bar. Hey, that seems like it's good. Click on the save, and guess what? That's the JSON content coming back as a response. What does that tell you? It really worked, right? So that's a good confidence to have that it actually came back with the JSON response. Yay, that's great. Well, okay, now that we have a JSON response, what should I do? I'm going to go back to the list GSP, and in the list GSP, I'm going to go to the form remote, and I'm going to say on success equals, and I'm going to say in this case, display task, or whatever you want to call it, data, and I'm going to put a little semicolon on it. Well, where do I create the display task? Ideally, you would create it in a separate JavaScript file, but I'm going to be lazy and put it right here. So I'm going to say var display task, and that's going to be a function that takes a data. And all I'm going to do is simply alert the data for now, so we can see that when the response comes back, we got a code that's going to run for us. So go back here, refresh this, and I'm going to say test2, click on create. Right there it pops up. That means it's working properly. We got a way to display that. But what should I do now? Well, I need to take the data and I need to stick it back into the table, isn't it? That's my last job, to put it back into the table. Well, before we do that, let's understand a few things. So we have come quite a long way here. So we have edited this page and we did all that wonderful things, but now we are interested in selecting. jQuery has a nice way to do selectors. You can implement a selector, and once you get a selector, you can say an action you want to perform on the selector. That's a very common way to use jQuery. So you're saying, here is the element I want to select, and once I select an element, I want to do something with it, right, or on it. So what are the selectors? The three main selectors are, you want to find an element given that particular element's tag name. So you can say, get me all the p tags, get me all the table tags, whatever it is. You can get it by the class. You can also get it by the ID. I generally prefer an ID because it helps me to quickly find the stuff. But I also tend to use classes quite a bit, because you can then change the class and the CSS will kick in and you can do some wonderful things with it. So, pick your poison, whichever you like, you can use that. And then you can also write code to say document ready. You can write functions to do something on document open. You can also write it as a function. All that is good stuff. You also have an XPath query for getting the table stuff. Well, that's a lot of stuff I talked about, but I want to see how it's going to work. Now, here is a way I would recommend not doing it. The way I wouldn't recommend doing it is, you say, okay, I got it. And then what do? You come here and write the code over here. And once you write the code over here, what's the next thing you're going to do? You're going to save the file. You're going to go to the browser. You're going to refresh the browser. And you're going to go enter the data, get to that point, and find out what? It doesn't work, right? If you say, hey, every time I do this, it works, this is great, right? You have the divine power. And whatever you have done to gain that divine power, keep doing that. But a mere mortal like me, it never works the first time. Actually, it doesn't work the second time either, right? And at some point, I'm like, please, work, right? That's the way it is most of the days, right? So that's a slow round trip for me to write the code. And when I write the code, what does it mean? It means that I kind of know what I'm doing. But most of the time, I don't have a clue what I'm doing, right? I'm experimenting with the code, trying to figure out what will work, because that's a lot of times we are kind of saying, yeah, I kind of have an idea, but how does this really fit together? So my recommendation is, do not write the code there. Well, instead, what should we do? Well, what I'm going to do here instead is, I'm going to go to the browser here. Go ahead and refresh the browser. So right there, the browser is sitting right there. Bring up the console. And once you bring up the console, go to the console. And right here in the console, what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to tell the console, I'm going to actually keep it like this so we can actually see a little bit of both. So what am I going to do here within the console? Well, within the console, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, what am I interested in? Some kind of a data with me. I really don't care what that actual data is, right? Who cares what that data is? As long as you get the data, we popped it and we saw the data is being displayed properly, so that's good. So what do I want to do with this? Well, what I want to do with this is, I want to take this data, but I want to be able to put it in this table. Well, but how do I get to the table first of all? Remember, we gave an ID for the table, didn't we? So I'm going to say $1, a pound, tasks, table, and you can see in this case, it brought us the entire table. But then I can say, well, tr colon first, that's the very first row of the table. Likewise, I could try a last, and that's the last row. Hey, notice it says task 8. So that keeps the ID in there, right? So here's something else I can do. I can say in this case row equals, then I can say $, a pound, because I'm using an ID, tasks, table, tr last. So this gives me the last row. So now that I have the very last row, which is test2, I can say row dot after, and I'm going to say blah. And notice how blah appeared right after the last row. Make sense so far? But except one problem, right? Where do I want to put this row? Where is it? Yeah, but where in the table? In the order. It's got to be in the alphabetical order. I can't simply say, it's in our alphabetical order, oh, you created one, I'll stick it to the bottom, right? And the user gets confused. It's like, I don't see it. Go enter again. Oh, you can't enter it because it really exists. Like, where does it exist? I don't see it, right? So you got to preserve that to the user. So what do you do to preserve that for the user? Well, you got to find out where it should appear first of all. Well, thankfully, we can do that. So let's go back and do a little bit more coding. So I'm going to go back to the controller, and in the controller I'm going to say, hey, don't just return me a task, do me a favor, return the task, but you also return, let's call it as, what is this called? Task ID, previous task ID is going to be previous task ID. What in the world is this previous task ID? Well, I'm going to say define previous task ID. Well, first of all, task we know. So we'll say index equals task.list, and we got all the tasks. So we'll say tasks. So now we can say define index equals task.index of, and we can specify the task. Couple of possibilities. This could be the very first one, or this could be somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to say define previous task ID equals if index is greater than 0. So what does that mean? If the index is 0, that means that's the very first one, right? which means you're not going to insert it after any of them. That's got to be the very first one. However, if the index is greater than 0, what does that mean? Oh, I got 1 and I can insert it right after that. So I can go find out. So if the index is greater than 1, then the previous task ID is tasks dot, and you could specify square bracket index -1 dot ID, else I'm going to specify a -1. So see if that makes sense. So the previous task ID, the one you found a task where you want to insert it, you want to know the previous one. Well, if the index is greater than 0, then it's whatever that index -1. If it is 0, I'm going to just return a -1. Are you happy with that so far? Right, so we know the position now. That's all we are sending. So now that we have the task ID, let's make sure that's coming through properly. So to do that, I'm going to go back into this code, and I'm going to go back and refresh this. So it's probably a good idea to just kill it and restart it. And I want to make sure I'm displaying this here in the list so we can actually see it. So that's good so far. So let's go ahead and refresh this. And what am I going to do this time? Well, I got some initial set of values, as you can see, to begin with. So let's go ahead and say, I want to add something that's going to be in the very bottom. So what would that be? Like the zebra, right? So I'm going to say zebra and click on create. Well, that's an object we got, but what is the object really? Sorry, I can't see that there. So I could go to the network and I can try to take a look at it. So we'll say zebra2 and click on create. And you can see the data come through, and you can examine this, and you can see that there's a task sitting there. Previous task ID is 4, right? And so that seems to have come through with the task ID of 4. But on the other hand, if I were to create, let's say, Al, and click on create, let's actually clear this when we do this. So click on that. Well, again, save came back. Click on that. Hey, what's the ID? Let's say its task ID is 5. Now, why did it become a 5? Does anybody know why it's called a 5? So that's right below this, right? JKL. So sure enough, that means I don't know my alphabetical orders, so we can fix that. So let's go back here and say AA and click on create. Let's see what it tells us. So click on that and look at that. That's still a 6. So where is that going to go? So let's go ahead and refresh that. That's tricky, isn't it? That's going to the lowercase. So you kind of get the point, right? So you can make sure it is actually at the right place. So right there is the AA, and you can click on it, and that's a 7. Okay, so I give up. So that's an example of how that can go around. I don't know why it actually said a 7 over there. That's kind of, maybe I wrote the code wrong. Can we make sure that it's correct? So what am I doing in this case? In the controller, I'm saying previous task ID. If the index is greater than 0, where index is coming from the task, so task.index of task, did we get the values? Aha! So that should be what? List ordered by name. That's the mistake I made, right? So that tells us that it's wrong. Again, a good reason why we definitely want to write tests for this and not just assume that the code is actually correct. All right, so we got that working so far. What's the next step? Now that we have the position given to us, and now that we know what data we want to insert into it, now the next step is to actually do the work. We're going to just check this one more time, and then we'll get back to doing the work. So now that we have all of that in place, what's the last step? Well, I want to be able to insert this at the right place, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's go back and take a look at what this is sending. So we'll say AA and click on that and take a look at the save. And what does the save say? It says a -1. So there you go. Okay, that worked. Now what should we do? Now that we have the result on our hand, we want to perform an insert. How do we perform the insert into this? Well, let's get back to this code for a second. Let's go to console. And in the console, I'm going to say, first of all, I know what row I'm dealing with, right? What's the row I'm dealing with? Well, that's the ID that we are being given. But we got a little bit of checking to do. So you can say row after equals if the data, well, what's the data? So let's say data equals, and I'm going to specify, what did I call this one as? Previous task ID, remember that? So previous task ID is be a -1. So now that I have the data with me, var data equals, and this is going to be a previous task ID. So there we go, that's an error. So data equals, so previous task ID is -1, so we got that data. So now I'm going to say var row after is equal to, and what should this be? If the previous task ID, well, that's in the data, right? So data.previous task ID is equal to -1. Then what? What are we getting as the row? The very first row, isn't it? So then it's going to be $1, a pound, tasks table, tr first, that's going to be the row. Otherwise, I want this to be $1, a pound, and a plus, right? What did I call it? Task plus, and it was the ID. What was the ID in this case? The previous data dot previous task ID. So that ends that one, and that should give us the value that we are interested in. So let's go ahead and say row after and see what the row after is. Sure enough, that's a row after, which is the first one if the data was -1. If you change that to not a -1, but let's say a 2, and rerun that code, and notice this time the row after is actually not the first one. So that code seems to work. Once that code works, then you get to use the world's best technology ever invented. You know what that is called, right? What is it? Copy and paste it. Copy that from there, and you go here to the list and say, well, I'm going to take that and paste it right there. So what does this say? It says, well, row after is, given the data's previous task ID, if it's -1, get me the very first row. If it is not, get me the row that makes sense. So that gives you that row. And we already saw what to do with this information, right? We said row after dot, what do you call it after this? Append. And what do you want to put in this case? Data.task. So save it, come back here. Let's make sure that's actually true. So we have a row after dot append, and I'm going to say blah, and let's actually run it, and right there is blah. But it should have actually been in the bottom, so we'll figure it out. So that's exactly what we did. We brought that in. Let's go back and rerun the code and see how it shows up. So refresh, and what am I going to do here? Well, once we refresh this, I'm actually going to get the refreshed value. So let's go ahead and say, what should I say here? Bake. So click on create, and where should that go? That didn't work. So what's going on? Let's look at the output here. So, oh, row after. Did I define it as a proper variable here? Let's make sure of that. So row after is equal to that data value. So that's basically the value we're getting from here. So row after. And that's going to become that value. So it is either this or that. Let's make sure I don't have a syntax error here. So that's the value we got from the row after. And I'm going to say row after dot, and I'm going to append to that. So does anybody see the error? Did I mess up the curly braces here? Yeah, where did that come from? So that should be ending with this, right? Yeah. So, thank you. So that's a copy-paste error. Got to be careful. Yeah, it's really hard for me to see it with such a big font here, unfortunately. But I'm glad you caught that. So let's go back and refresh this. And what are we saying here? Line 23 is unhappy. Let's see what that is. So the curly braces is not closed. Where's the curly braces that should be closing here? So this one, this function, right? Yes, that's what it was. Excellent. So right there is our function that's ending. Wonderful. So now let's go back and refresh it. Oh, that's better. So it's quiet. So let's take that away. And let's go ahead and say kick and click on that. So you can see that's coming up here. It should really be here. So the format, where's the format? Row after should be the actual row itself. And is it append? Is append the right thing to do? So if I were to go back here and go to the console, and here's the console, So I'm going to take the first row, let's say row equals, and let's say in this case is pound tasks table, and so this is going to be tr first. So I've got the very first row, so row dot, and what am I going to say? After, and I'm going to say blah, right? So you can see how that works, right? So that's going to be after right there. So let's go back, try this one more time. So refresh, and here is bake 2, click, there you go. So that seems to work just fine, isn't it? However, when you are, so what did we learn so far? Don't rush to write the code, play with the console, get your Ajax jQuery written. This is really power, right? One of the things I've learned over time is we can do really faster development when we have a rapid feedback loop. When you don't have a rapid feedback loop, what happens? This is like I'm going to blind your eyes and say drive on the road, right? Or forget about driving. I'm on the treadmill every morning. I can be on the treadmill, I can think. I can definitely think about so many things. Most of the tweets I do when I'm on the treadmill. But I can never close my eyes on the treadmill. I don't understand why, right? I'm running in the same spot in the stupid machine. Why can't I close my eyes? My brain says, oh, immediately I go out of position, right? Because the eyes are giving a constant feedback loop to the brain, and the brain says, just keep running. And the minute you close your eyes, the brain says, oh, you just shut off a feedback loop for me. I won't really function anymore. That's weird, isn't it? But that's where we work. Well, when you're on the browser, that's an immediate feedback loop for you. So you're able to adjust where you're going rather than saying, well, write your code now, save the file, run this browser now, start the application now. That's too much of a slow feedback loop. There's no reason to do that. You have a really fast feedback loop. So now that we have done that, what's the next thing we want to do? Well, you have a display, but you want to really give a feedback to the user that something happened, right? If you quietly update a window, what happens? The user doesn't know you did this. So what does the user do? The user clicks and says nothing happened. And what does the user do? Oh, nothing happened, I'm going to leave. Does the user say no? Click, 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 click more. It's even worse if this was a transaction. And every time you click on it, you're taking money from their account. Not going to be fun, right? You made a very angry user when they find out what happened, right? So you want to definitely give a feedback loop. So what I recommend is, when the user clicks on it, open a modal dialog. What do you think? No, right? That's the worst thing you can do. Because you open a modal dialog, it becomes very painful. I was trying to rent a car. I couldn't make this up. Seriously. I go to the counter, and this guy has a web application, and he wants to enter my details in there so he can process my rental car. And literally, I've never ever seen this happen before, never ever seen this happen after. He brings his hands together, and he does like this. He keeps on going like this for about almost endlessly, right? And I got a little suspicious. I leaned over. He said, oh, don't worry about it. I said, I'm sorry, but I shouldn't really mess with you, but can I ask you what you're doing? He says, without missing a beat, he says, oh, you know what? This stupid application throws about 150 modal dialogues on me, but don't worry. I've mastered ways to kill this. This is what this guy does every minute, right? Books reservations. And he does this, like, and then afterwards, there it's gone. I'm like, my dear God, what did they do to him, right? Maybe they have a little flag that says, if it's Joe, turn this on, right? I don't think anybody else is getting it, right? Maybe that's the way they punish their employees, some select employees, right? You did that, okay, next week you're on this application. But that's stupid, right? So you really want a feedback, but not an intrusive feedback. I'm a huge fan of things that kind of appear, but after a sensible amount of time, they quietly disappear, right? I don't want that to be sticking there, which is even worse. Because you've done something else, now you're looking at a stale message that can be confusing, right? Well, also, don't take to that extreme, where you make this really glittery, and the user does something, and the entire page jumps up and down, and celebrates it, right? And the user kind of gets very annoyed after a while. So don't be just, it's like, oh, you entered this data and the whole window shakes, right? Don't do that. Or don't let things run away. It's like, oh, where did that go, right? And you don't want to do that. Other worse things to do. A user enters the data, don't start playing national anthem, right? They're like, oh, this is working, right? It's like, oh, turn on the volume. I mean, there are times you're working when your baby, maybe a child or a grandchild is sleeping. And you ever wake up the baby, you're never going to have that customer back, right? So they're going to get very angry with you. So how do you do this? Well, before we do it, let's look at a couple of options. But I'll give you one example of this. I was working on an application where I have a collection, but a user will actively come and delete a particular data from the database. But I got a sorted collection. So when a user clicks on a delete button, I want this particular row to wake up and kind of like and disappear, right? So that gives you a nice view that you literally are, it's going up in smoke. I have another application where a user literally wants to move data. So when a user moves the data, the destination is different, depending on what they are moving. So when they click on a move button, I really want to show this actually is literally moving in the UI on the browser. From here it gets up and goes and lands in the destination and disappears, right? So these kinds of animations can be very helpful to give a visual cue rather than putting that stupid modal that says your data has been moved, right? And the user then has to like click, and then it's like, okay, enter another data, and then your data has been moved, click. And this is like taxing the users. Taxing the user because every time they do something, you say, okay, give me some tax now, right? I'm going to hurt you. You got to do some extra work. So how do we go about doing this? Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to bring in a jQuery UI. Again, use the right library version, whatever that may be for your application version. So I'm going to go to the config for this. And in the config, I'm going to simply say, here is my runtime, and I'm going to bring in the jQuery UI. I'm going to go to the main GSP, and I'm going to bring in the jQuery UI also, so dash UI. And what's the very next thing I should do? Check to make sure it's there. So go to the view and go down to, oh, wait a minute, that didn't even go well. So let's go ahead and kill that, restart it, see what it's doing. So I brought in that particular thing. Let's go ahead and restart it, make sure that's coming up. So go to the list. So refresh this. Come on. And now with the view of the list itself, with the initial data, we should now be able to see view and look for the jQuery, and right there is the UI. So that shows it's there, right? So you need to go through that extra step. Now that we have done that, let's talk about a few things you can do. A couple of interesting things you can do. First, I can go back to the UI, and in the UI, let's bring up the console, and notice I have this Ajax create. So let's say row equals a pound task 1. Close that. So row dot hide. Right, that went away. I can say row dot show. That pops up. So what you can do is you can say, well, I'm simulating this behavior here. User clicks on something, and a user clicks on it. I'm going to send an Ajax call to the server and say, hey server, kick that from the database. So on the server side it's gone. But you got to reflect that back on the client side, right? Because if you don't remove it from the client side, now your client view is different from the real state, and that's going to confuse the user. And of course you can do a full round trip, but instead you can just disappear it. Likewise, if you have to bring it back based on something else, maybe an undo. Or what you can do, you can not only do a show or a hide, you can do a toggle. I like toggle really well. So you can say row.toggle, and you can say toggle it back and forth for me. So right there, it's gone. The first item, Ajax create. Now it's back. So toggle can give you a way to go back and forth. So where toggle is helpful is you don't have to know whether it's visible or not. You're simply toggling the state, right? That becomes easy depending on what you're trying to do. So that can be very nice for animation purposes. Then what can you do? You can also fade. Fade in, fade out. So let's try that. So I can go back here and say, well, row.fade in, and I can say bring it in. Or I can say fade out. And what does that do? So fade out, took it away. Fade in, bring it back. So unlike show and hide, it takes a little bit of a transition, right? So this can be a nice effect to show something is happening. There are two benefits of this feature. One, you can make it very nice eye candy. This also is very helpful to waste a lot of hours on it, right? So if you're really bored at work, get into jQuery animations, you will not even see. It's like, wow, is it already 5 o'clock, right? So it's a nice way to blow this away. I would sit there and start tweaking things like, and halfway through it, like, oh, you know what? It would be so cool if we can do this. And then about 30 minutes later, it's like, no work got done, right? And you just play with things. Sometimes you get really good ideas, and that's definitely welcome, right? So absolutely. And then what happens? You can also say, in this case, toggle for this. So fade toggle or toggle to. In this case, you can give a delay for the animations that can work. One of my favorite is these two guys, pulsate and highlight. Those are my favorites. The reason those are my favorites is because I feel that those are the pretty lightweight, sensible things. So for example, I'm going to say row.effect, and I'm going to simply say over here, highlight. So notice in this case, you see that highlight come through, right? So it nicely comes, shows that and moves away. So it's a very easy way to give a very quick feedback. You could also say pulsate. So you could do that, just a gentle little flicker, right? You see that? So either one, whatever makes you happy. Now that we have that working, and we know how this is working, let's go back to the code. And what are we going to say? Row after dot next dot effect. Why? Because row after is the one after that you added. And what is the effect you want? Pick one. Highlight or pulsate? Pulsate, okay, pulsate. So we'll pick that. So go back here, do a refresh of this page. So here is our AA. Click on create. That works, right? So let's go ahead and change it to bake. And let's click on create. And you can see that. And let's finally say zebra to make sure it's coming in the bottom. So you can see that's working as well. It's sorted order. Sorting was not really that difficult, right? As long as you can find out from the server and push it to the client and say, insert it right in the middle, right in here. That can be very powerful. Not a whole lot of code, right, to do this. And once you figure out how to do this, you can modularize that into a separate function. Then you can start calling it from different places. You don't have to duplicate that effort over and over. That can save yourself a lot of effort as well. So we saw how to integrate that with Grails, the jQuery libraries, and some of the lessons we learned. Don't rush. Do this in incremental steps. Play with the browser. Console is your friend. Take a look at the network. See what's coming back. Once you see these things, you know whether they are working or not. If it's not working, you got a little bit of work to debug rather than a boatload of code you wrote, and now you're totally lost, right? So take very small steps. This also helps you to know what these individual steps are doing, right? Gives you control. One of the things we do is when we lose control, we have a bigger stress. When we gain control, we have low stress. Anybody here who wants more stress? No, right? That's what children are for, to give us that. But we don't want any more stress when we write code, so we can just focus on that. That's a lot better. Well, I hope you found that useful. That's all I have. Thank you. Well, what if things don't work? Well, thankfully, I had a 100% automated test on this code, and I switch over the database from my little tinny-mini in-memory database to the real database I want to use, and guess what? A few of my tests fail. And a little panic ensues. I got only 2 weeks now. What do? Look at what the error is. Find out what the details are. Fix it. It took exactly 5 minutes. Run all the tests. All the tests are passing. It's like, hey, that's done. But without having the automated test, there is really no way to be able to do that, right? And I'm also a huge fan of writing test before I write the code. Well, with languages or frameworks or tools or libraries, whatever you want to call it, like Grails, you really have ability to do fantastic flexibility and development. But that comes with a price. While that flexibility can help you a great deal, it can also hurt you quite a bit because you could make inappropriate changes. Maybe you could make a change that doesn't really work properly. And then as a result, what happens? Well, things begin to break and fall apart. And that's not really fun at all when that begins to happen. So what can we do to prevent that? Well, one way to prevent that is to really have a reasonable amount of test cases so we can have the feedback loop. So we want to really get that feedback and we want automated testing. But why is testing so hard? I'll tell you why testing is so hard. There are two reasons why testing is very hard. The first reason why testing is very hard is because we don't want to do it. And we are like, I don't want to write the test case. I would rather write the code. So that makes testing really hard. We are also worried that we'll be really slow if we write the test cases, right? All those pressures kind of kick in. That's one problem. But the other problem, there's other couple of reasons. Testing is very hard when the code is designed poorly. You cannot just take a random code and say, I want to write test on it. Testing code is like making the children eat vegetables, right? They don't want to eat vegetables. You got to kind of entice them to eat vegetables. So when you take a code, arbitrary code, and say, I want to write a test on it, and the code says, no, get out of here. I don't want you to test me, right? That's one problem. The second problem is, you haven't understood how the code actually works. It's really hard to write a test on it. Now, sometimes it feels like an insult, right? What do you mean I don't understand the code? I'm the one who wrote it. I can tell you how many times I've come across developers, me included, where I've written the code works, but don't ask me how it works, right? Most of the time we found a template example over there. I'm like, typing the same thing. Oh, it works. So I had to write a code where I have to go deploy something on the cloud with a certain configuration, and then pull the data back, and then see if it's working properly. Well, for all of this, it was easy to write the code. It only took me 15 minutes to write the code. But how do I test this? I never had a clue how to test it. And I said, why don't I have a clue to test it? Well, that's when I understood that I don't understand how all this actually works put together. I know what the APIs are to call, but I don't know how it works. So learning how things actually work is a way for us to start writing test cases. So a lot of times I force myself to do this. Okay, so we're committed to writing test cases, now what? Well, most companies, there are three kinds of companies there. One company says, we don't do any testing, and they're in trouble already. The second group of people say, we believe in testing, so what do? They bring all these people with a good title called automation engineer. And an automation engineer, let's say he's an automation engineer. He says, knock, knock, hey, who are you? Hey, I'm the new guy, I'm the automation engineer. Oh, yeah, welcome. Who are you? Well, I'm the programmer. And by the way, come on to our company. Thanks for coming. Now, step out of my way. I don't want you to bother me, right? So the minute this happens, what do the automation engineers do? They say, hey, our job is to automate. The programmers don't want to help us. What do? Well, we're going to start automating at the UI level. Automating at the UI level is extremely brittle, isn't it? Things break too often. Things are hard to maintain. Tests become slow. And eventually this all fizzles out. This is, my cone calls this as ice cream cone pattern. Ice cream cone sounds really tasty, but this one is not. The ice cream cone pattern is, think of this cone, right? That's a cone. More tests at the UI level and very few tests at the lower level. That's your ice cream cone. You don't want to hold a ice cream, because what that means is you have a very no feedback loop in the bottom, and a very brittle and slow feedback loop in the top. What you want is the inverted pyramid, right? You want the pyramid. The pyramid says, I will have few tests in the top, and as you go down the layers, I'll have more and more tests. And that's what you really want. More tests in the bottom layers and fewer in the top. I'm not saying zero in the top, but I just want to make sure the connectivity is there, a smoke test in the top, but I want very, very rapid feedback loop in the bottom. So if we can tell ourselves to write tests before we write code, we can definitely do that, and that's a test pyramid. So we want to do test-driven development and enjoy the quick feedback loop. But I want to emphasize one more thing. I will never tell you, I used to, but not anymore. I will never tell you, don't do manual testing. I'll tell you, manual testing is so useful. In an application I was developing, I went for literally days where I only ran automated tests. I never ever bothered to run the app. And a few days goes by, and a little suspicion in my mind. Is this really working? Because I never actually brought the application up, right? I was only running automated tests every time I ran the code. And also I said, hey, it's just fun to play with this, right? So I bring the application up. As soon as the application comes up, and I'm touching the keyboard, immediately my mind races through and says, oh, you know what? I could do this a lot better than what I have right now. I could change this. I can make this more usable. I can make it more intuitive. And I'm frantically writing on a piece of paper all the thoughts that come to my mind. Where did I have those thoughts before? They never came to me. Why? Because I was not seeing it. This is one thing we humans do really well, right? This is called an observer effect. Observer effect is the minute you observe something, you want to change it. And you want to benefit from the observer effect for sure. So do manual testing, but don't do 100% manual testing. It should be part of what you do, but not a majority of what you do. So that's why we want to really write these automated tests. That becomes extremely important. So given this, Grails actually gives us a good way to do this. They have unit test, integration test, and functional test. So what are these kinds of tests? Unit, integration, functional, what they call as these, the terms are a bit confusing to me because I use a different term than what Grails uses. But essentially what they are talking about here is, in their definition, this is the test on the domain class, this is the test on the controller level, and these are the tests on the UI level. And again, these are the standards in the industry, that's the terms they're using. But let's learn with an example. So what do I want to do? I want to create every single line of code, but I want to do it only with a test first. So let's start with what we create. Let's discuss the features I want to create. So I want to create a Grails application. So Grails, and then I'm going to say create app. And the application I want to create here, I'm going to call it as a directory. Now this directory is just a group of friends directory I'm going to maintain here. That's all I'm going to do. So, so let's say I want to create a directory app. So what does the directory app do? Keeps a bunch of friends' names, their name and email address, right? Very simple. That's what I'm going to create. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go to the directory and I'm going to say, well, let's pull up the code base here. I'm going to say, what is the code I want to create in this case? Well, I want to create, first of all, a domain class. So I'm going to say Grails, create domain class, and I'll call this as person. So the name I gave for this is called a person. So what am I going to do now that I have a person in my code? So I'm going to bring up the person.groovy. So you can see that the person is sitting here, the person class. But what do I do normally? Well, normally I would start writing code right here, right? I would start saying, well, here is the name, whatever details I want to put. But I'm not going to put any code. I'm not going to write a single line of code until a test actually fails. So now what do I want to do? Well, now that I have this class, it also created, the little tool we used also created a specification. This spec is actually a person spec. But in the case of Grails, they actually use Spock. I'm a big fan of Spock. Spock makes it very easy to write test. It's very fluent. So what am I going to do? Here's my person test, and it even pleads with you, test something, please. Well, I'm going to say test a valid person. I don't know what that means yet. Expect, and I'm going to say expect, let's say John Doe dot validate. Well, the validate method will be true if the object is valid, meaning it could be saved. Otherwise, it will give us a false. Now I need a John Doe, so I'm going to say define John Doe, and within the setup, I'm going to say John Doe equals new person over here, and I'm going to say first name is John, and I'm going to say last name is going to be Doe, and email address, so we'll call it email address, is going to be, let's say, example.com, right? So given this, we just created this person object. That's all we did. And the person object simply says, I got a first name, last name, and an email address. We don't have these. But I want to run the test and see what actually happens. So let's bring up the command prompt here. Let's go to the directory where this code is sitting. I called it directory, if you recollect. So let's make sure I'm in the right place. So this should be Grails. So I'm going to go to the directory where the Grails is, and this is called directory. There we go. And so let me set the flags here that I really need to use. And what am I going to do now? Well, I'm ready to run the test. So how do I run the test? Well, I'm going to simply say in here, Grails run, Grails test app. So that's going to run the test. So it loads the files necessary and says, okay, I'm ready to pull those in and run the test. And once it compiles all the code, this is running in the test environment to give us the feedback very quickly. And you can see that in this case, it comes back and tells us, well, we have only one test and running one test and one test completed. And so he's happy with that. The test actually passed, right? So that's our test right there, test passed. Now, I'm also, not only do I like really rapid feedback loop, I'm also fundamentally very lazy. Now, you could use IDEs, and there's nothing wrong with using an IDE. But if you're using an IDE, normally configure things in an IDE, and what do? You run things from an IDE. I'm okay as long as the details so much from you that you don't have a clue what you're doing, right? Or the IDE makes your life so easy for one set of things and so hard for other set of things. The things that it made hard, you don't do even practices, right? You want to get to the point where the IDE doesn't become an automatic, it doesn't become a slave to the IDE. So I do quite a few things to give me rapid feedback loops. So for example, I'm going to say in this case, Grails, so I'm interested in running Grails, and I'm going to say test app, but I want to run this if any GUI file automatically changes. So you can write your own scripts like this. So now if you notice, I've got the code here, but if I modify the code, it would recognize that I modified the code and it can rerun the test for me automatically. So what that means is, I could be, obviously I've blown up the font size here. Usually my font size is much smaller, my window is pretty big, and I'm going to have both of those side by side. Usually I even would overlap these windows so I can see this window in the back. I'll be just coding away and hitting the save button, and the test will run automatically, pass or fail, and that's a feedback loop. I don't have to really do anything different than saving the file, and the test is going to run automatically. You can look for tools like this. There are quite a few that does this. One example of such a tool for JavaScript is a tool called Karma, right? Karma does this for you automatically. It'll detect file change and run your test automatically. Similar concepts, right? There are concepts like this quite a bit available. So given this, what you have here is an ability to run these tests, but you notice the test actually passed even though we don't have a first name and last name. Why is that? Well, the reason it passed is it simply ignores those properties if you have not used it. So to make sure that's actually working, I'm going to say in this case John, and I'm going to say equals John Doe dot first name. Doe is equal to John Doe dot last name, and finally I'm going to say here whatever that example.com, so example.com, so this is going to be at example.com, and what do we do here? Is equal to John Doe dot email address. So if I run this now, we are actually asking for the first name and the last name property from it. And clearly we haven't really put those properties into the class, and as a result, our test should actually fail saying, I'm sorry, I don't understand what properties you're talking about. So now we can go back here. You can see the test actually failed. Pardon me, it says that it's failed. So what should I do now? Well, now is a good time. String of first name. So implement that. String last name and string email address. So implement those 3 properties and you are ready to move on to the next test. Now that we have that one test running and the name is valid, the person is valid, what do we do next? Well, I want to write tests for validations. Now, let's ask the question, do I really need tests for validation? After all, the code to validate is so small, you write more tests than the code itself, right? So much more than the code itself. Well, what can I do about it? Let me tell you why I would like to have tests for validation. I joined a project, and the project had been going on for only 3 weeks at that point. So it was a relatively new project. It's just that I joined after 3 weeks. And I'm looking through the code, and these guys were really good at writing tests. But I was looking through the test cases, and I found while they have tests, they had not written tests for validation rules. But there was code that did the validation. So my first reaction was, oh, these guys did not write a test for validation. I should write the test for validation. And then I thought to myself, you know what, these guys are going to laugh at me. They're going to laugh at me saying, hey, that's so trivial. Why do you waste your time writing the test for validations? And then I said to myself, you know what, I'm just still going to do it because I feel that's the right thing to do. So I write the test for validation, and guess what happened? The validation test actually failed. And I was a bit shocked. Why would the validation test fail? The validation code is already there, right? Well, it turned out that the validation code they had written, they thought it was correct. And guess what? I thought it was correct too when I looked at it. But it was not. And one of the conditions I had written was not taken care of. And it was like, aha, found the problem. That was an inadequate code. Modify the code and the validation test actually passed. So that was a good lesson learned in that experience. So what do I want to do here in terms of validation? The first validation I want to write here is I want to write the validation for the field. What field am I interested in? Well, the field I'm interested in is the first name. So I'm going to say test first name required. So let's write that first name is required. And now what am I going to do? So notice I created a John Doe right here. Here is something we could do. If you were to write a separate object at this point, you have to set up the object properly, except for the first name, and you're going to get very tired doing this. Because for every test, you got to start providing the data over and over. So one common thing that I'd like to do is, I would simply go to our good friend John Doe, and I would say first name is equal to empty. So I took an existing object which is valid, and I simply made it invalid. Then I say expect, and in this case, in the expect, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply say John Doe.validate, and this better be false. False equals, right? So this becomes a false to say, well, no, it's not valid. But don't trust that. It could be invalid for 1,000 reasons. You want to know why it's invalid. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that first name empty equals John Doe.errors dot get field error, and the field I'm interested in is the first name dot rejected values. So what I'm going to use here is the rejected value. I want to call that to say here's the reason why it was not. So I saved that. So I took the John Doe, removed the name, called the validate, and then made sure it is this error. Well, what's going to happen? We did not write a validator. And because we did not write a validator, this is going to have trouble, right? So it's got to fail and say, oh, sorry, you did not write a validator, and as a result, I'm going to go ahead and tell you it's failing. So clearly you can see that failed. But this is a negative test, or well, it's a negative test, right? You're making sure it's failing. So what am I going to do? I go back to the code, and in the code, I'm going to say constraints, and we're going to say first name blank is false. So we added this rule only after we wrote the test. And this says the first name property cannot be a blank, right? That's the way you specify that rule in this particular case. So you can see the test is passing, right, after we added that. Likewise, what we can do is we can write another test, and this test says last name is required. So change it to last name and change this to last name, save it, and of course it would require last name, and then you would say in this case, specify that blank is false for that. So we took care of the two validators, right? One to validate that first name is required, another to validate that the last name is required. Great. So far so good, right? It's easy so far. But let's get to the next test. The next test says, in this case, void test email address is unique. So I'm going to say Jane Doe. Wait a minute, the test actually failed. I better not go. So let's see why it failed. So here is the errors. Get field last name. Yeah. So last name, you're right. Good, thank you. So now, what am I going to do as the next test? Test email address is unique. So Jane Doe equals new person. First name is Jane. Last name, you could say Doe, but email address is going to be what? John Doe dot email address. So I'm sharing the email address between two people. Yes?
Will setup run once or like once per test?
The setup will run once per test.
Okay, so the last name will not be there.
The last name on line number 36 will not be there, but when you come to line 43, it will be there, because setup runs for every single test, once per test.
Once per test.
That's right. So setup and cleanup will be doing sandwiching. You'll run setup, your test cleanup, setup, your test cleanup. So that's the reason why I like to put it in the setup. That way it doesn't get impacted on the other tests. It minimizes the amount of code I have to write. So I do one setup and I can just reuse it. Life becomes easy. Now let's look at this code here. I created a Jane Doe with the same email address. Then I say expect Jane Doe dot validate, and this should be what? We don't want Jane to be valid anymore in this case, right? Why? Because Jane shares the same email address as John, not allowed. What is the rejected value? Well, rejected value is John Doe dot email address is equal to Jane Doe dot errors dot, and you're going to specify, what is the value you're going to specify here? Jane Doe dot errors dot get field errors on email address, and then you're going to specify rejected value. Well, if I run this test, the test will fail because we have not provided a uniqueness constraint. But not so fast. There's a bit of a problem here. If I give you an object, if I want to find out if a name exists or not, the only thing I have to examine is that object. Same for first name. But for uniqueness, I cannot look at that object, right? I got to go to the database and say, hey, database, do you have another person with the same email address? Now, guess what happened? We got dragged into the database. Who wants to do that? Nobody here, right? Because that's a lot of work. Well, this is one of the beautiful things about Grails, the way they have done it. What you can do is you can tell Grails, hey Grails, I'm going to perform an operation like validate, but this has to perform a uniqueness constraint check, but the uniqueness constraint check has to be performed against the data in the database. And Grails says, well, but you're in the unit test. You don't want to drag in a database. What should I do? And Grails test says, there's an idea. What if I completely mark out GORM? Well, if I completely mark out GORM and without any effort, but for validation, I should check if the value is in the database. Let's replace the value word database with something a little different. You want to check uniqueness constraint against objects in a pool. So if I give you a pool, pretend the pool is the database, then you can say, tell me the object you're looking for is not in this pool. Yay, that's great, isn't it? That simplifies the life so much. So notice what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go back here and say, well, given this particular constraint, I'm going to say mark for constraints test. So I'm going to go back to the setup method, and in the setup method I'm going to say mark for constraints test. The person is the class we are constraining, and the object is going to be John Doe. That becomes your pool. And you are saying, this is my pool of objects. I only have one object now, which is John Doe with that email address. Now come and make sure that in that pool, there is no object with the same email address as Jane's email address. Well, sorry, there is. Yep.
But you could have also done just John Doe.save, which also goes against.
Excellent question. I'm glad you asked that. So here's the problem. If you did a save, very good question. If you did a save, where does it save to? It would need the database.
No, the mock gone, I'm assuming.
Right, but we don't have a mock pool yet. It's got to go sit somewhere, right? Where does it go sit? If you don't have a pool to sit into, it's got to go to the database. But because the database stuff is completely mocked out, what's going to happen now? So that's one problem, right? Second, you don't really care about save, because that object could always be saved. When you are doing this test normally, you are creating an object and saying, make sure it's against all the objects in the database. You don't really care about calling a save at that time, right? On another object, that is, for example. So as a result, and also it's much better that you don't even have a call save in this code then. So now, of course, that's going to still fail, because we haven't implemented the constraint. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to say email address, and I'm going to say unique is true, and I'm asking him to check for the uniqueness constraint. So right now the test is going to fail because I haven't saved this yet. So right there is the failure of the test. I save it, and now it's going to run through, and at this point it should show us that the test is actually passing, because we have validated against the pool of object. So this validation actually literally comes from that pool that we created for the person where John Doe is sitting right there. And so this validator comes and says, oh, thanks, I'm going to check for it. Well, of course, it's still failing. Let's understand why it's failing. So let me look at the error message, GUI 44. So it's not happy here. Let's say Jane Doe equals new person. First name is Jane, last name is Doe, email address is John Doe's email address. Okay, that's good so far. Let's see what this is saying more. So, oh, no such property, of course. My silliness. So define that. There we go. That should take care of it. So that's an example of how you can write the test for validation of this. And this is very powerful because you can set up nice scenarios. Like when I have multiple constraints to evaluate, put that in the pool, run your validate, it checks against that, life is good, right? So that is something you can do. Yep, please.
There is a constraint block. I mean, what I'm really seeing here is you're actually creating a safety net to say that the domain properties or the domain rules never change, right? I'm assuming the Grails team has done enough job when they define those constraints, those name constraints.
That's right.
They've done an awesome job in terms.
Yeah, we're not interested in testing Grails.
Yes.
Yes.
This is a safety net for our domain class.
Well, it's not necessarily a safety net. It's an assertion that we have actually used Grails to perform these kinds of uniqueness validation. I'll give you an example of this. Tomorrow your rules change. You are saying, well, an email is only unique among people with a certain last name, for example, right? Well, as your rules are evolving, you modify the code, you constantly are adding stuff and removing, which is what happened in the application I was mentioning. The 3 weeks time, they had come and made a few changes to this. Well, in making a few changes to this, that actually broken a constraint and we didn't even know that. So all you're saying is, I know Grails does this good job of maintaining these constraints. Am I using those constraints properly? Right? Did I set the right fields? Did I type a field name? Did I give a combination that is actually not working? For example, in one application, we had a fairly stringent regular expression for validation. How do I know that regular expression is working, right? So when you say my value for a certain field must follow a certain format, right? This was insurance request coming in. Oh, you got to make sure that's in the particular format. Well, I can key in a regular expression and I can hope and pray it is right, or I can actually write the test to say, yep, this regular expression is doing this, and 2 months from now a programmer comes in and modifies the regular expression. Well, the test wake up and say, sorry, this doesn't work at this point, right? That's the feedback loop you really want. That's the key here. Okay, so we finished that. You can continue to write these kinds of tests for the models. But what about the controller? One thing I've been fascinated by is when you say write the code test first, I've come across programmers who will simply protest and say, I don't understand. How could I write a test without having the code? Right? Can we think about this a little differently? Are you writing the code with the code? Or are you writing the code without the code? It's kind of a stupid question, right? Of course you're writing the code without the code, right? That's the first time you're writing it. Well, then how do you know what to write? Well, we kind of thought about it. We tried a few things. We wrote a little code here, and that didn't work. We changed it. We kind of hacked around until we got something working. Well, I'll say two things. One, if you're writing test first, you're going to write the test before you write the code, which means you kind of have to have an idea about what code you're going to write. So you come up with a vision of the code you're going to write the test, and then make sure that minimum code for that, and you evolve the code. You say, okay, that's great, but I absolutely have no clue at all what code I'm going to write. What should I do? Well, my argument is prototype. Write a prototype. Don't write that code in production. You don't have a clue? That's perfectly fine. Write a separate prototype. Make the prototype work. Play with it. Once you get a feel for what the code is, move it away, come back to the production code, and start writing tests for it first. Yep.
I think TDD is also a little bit of, it's an initiation, right?
It is.
I think only when you, it's all good to hear, but I think only when you kind of sit besides a trained or an experienced developer,
yeah,
you kind of catch on to that a little more easily.
True. This is where it's not a mechanical process, right? Because a lot of times when people think of TDD, they think it's a mechanical process. And, oh, I got to write a test. Okay, well, I'm done now, right? No. You got to let the test grow your interface. Then you got to let the test grow your guts of the code, right? And to me, even that requires some kind of an implementation in the mind. If you ask me, okay, you got some implementation in your mind, you wrote this code test-driven, is the code implementation exactly what you thought? I'll say invariably it's not. Give me a direction to go. But when I'm working with something that I have absolutely no clue, because I've never ever done this, I find it very frustrating to do TDD, right? It's like, where do I even start? And that's when I go do a random, isolated prototype, and then I'm like, oh, now I got an insight into one possible solution. Now let me drive it TDD. And when I finish it, the prototype solution implementation is very different from the implementation I create in production. So that again is an evidence that TDD can change your design, right? Yeah, absolutely. So one of the phrases I normally use is, when you're going to do TDD, you got to be very awake. You got to be very conscious, right? You got to actively steer this. If you let TDD drive you, rather than you driving the TDD, right? That's very important to be cautious on that front. That's extremely important. So given that, what do I want to do with the controller? Well, first of all, I need a controller. Without a controller, I can't do much. So Grails create controller, and I'm going to say in this case a person, right? That's what is a controller I'm going to create, much like the other one. So now that I'm creating a person controller, what am I going to do here? Oh, wait a minute, create controller. Now, why is he unhappy with create controller? Let's try the one. Did I misspell it? Okay. So let's go back here, bring the person controller, and you can see the person controller sitting here. And I'm also going to bring person controller spec, and that beautiful class is sitting here. But what do I want to do now? Well, here's some good news. The minute you bring a person controller spec, they quickly realize it's a controller test. They automatically inject a controller in your environment. So an object of the controller is available to you directly. But I'm going to add one more thing. I'm going to now add mock for person, because you're going to use the person, so I'm going to say mock for person. Now what do I do here? Well, the very first thing is test list. So I'm going to go call a list, and I want to make sure the list is coming back with a certain data. But I need a certain data for this, and remember what we talked about earlier. If you have a real database, you can go get the data from the real database. But if you don't have a real database, what do? Well, you want to use a set of mock objects for this. So what I want to do here is, let's go ahead and say, well, in this case, I want to pick a sample data, a very small sample data. So I will put that into the setup method. So in the setup, I'm going to simply say, well, here are my sample objects. So mock domain, and then I say person, that's the pool, and in the pool, I put 4 person objects, right? That's all I've done, added them to this particular pool. Now I can come back to this test and say test controller.list. So I'm directly calling the list on the controller. Typically what will happen? The browser, you go to the browser and enter something and you click on a button, and what does the browser do? Comes all the way and calls a method on the action on the controller. Well, rather than having a browser to do this, line number 25 simply becomes the call you are making, right? So you're saying, pretend that I'm the browser, call that method. So we call the list method. But what would you typically do in the list? You would return square bracket tasks or people colon people.list, right? And that's what you're going to return. So do you know the name for what you return from an action? What do you call it? Say that again? Not quite. What you return from an action, what is the technical name for it? No. You would run the render, but in this case I'm not rendering anything at all. I'm going to let Grails do the rendering, but I'm going to return some data from the to the Grails part to do the work, but we don't call it data. What do we call it normally? Nope, it's called a model. That's a term they use, right? A model. Model is a poorly termed, named term, but it's a data returning. So you normally put a square bracket. It's a hash map, right? A model you're returning. So notice what I'm going to do here. Right off the bat, I'm going to say define model equals. Then what should I do here? Expect. And what should I expect here? 4. So I have 4 people, right? 4 equals model dot people dot size. I'm going to run this. It's going to fail. We'll come back and fix it. So notice in this case I said the test the list, go call the list, get the model out of it. Once you get the model, check me the people dot size is actually 4. So that guarantees you that all that 4 people came out for that given person, right? That's what you're trying to do. So now what should I do? Well, let's go to the list, if I can find where it is. So here is the person spec. I don't need that. Here is the controller. Yep, there we go. Go to the controller. And what am I going to do here? I'm going to simply say define list. And what should I do here? Square bracket people and person dot list. So that's your model, right? Square bracket people colon person dot list. That's called the model. And so you're returning a model. And what does the other side of the code do? The other side of the code says, well, thanks for giving me a model. I'm going to verify that model people dot size is equal to 4. Yep.
This is very useful. We are taking account. Suppose we are mocking like adding one more person over there.
Yeah, but why would you want to add more? right? So come up with a very practical example. If you feel that is necessary, don't convince yourselves that you need to only have one test suite. You can have more than one test suite also, right? So usually if you are polluting a lot of objects, there are two signs of it. One, you're trying to test way too many things in one area. That's a lack of cohesion. Second, maybe you're trying to test too many things that don't have to be actually tested. So you really don't need that many objects. Remember, the more objects you create, for example, that's a burden you're going to carry with you. I don't want that many objects around to carry for the testing purpose. So you want to keep it small. Yeah, you're right. It could get brittle, but it doesn't have to all the time. It doesn't have to get brittle all the time. So what am I doing here? So I'm saying model.people.size is 4, and that's from the list method. So controller.list, right? Controller.list. I'm typing the wrong stuff. So controller's list, and once you call the controller's list, model is there and model.size. Of course, I have to implement the code for this, and the code for that says people and return person.list. So far so good. However, second requirement, I need to sort. I need to sort the data and display it, right? So sorting is needed. So how do I do test for sorting? Well, let's start with this. Oh, wait a minute, it's failing. Let's fix the failure first. Then we'll come back and talk about it. So he's unhappy with line number 25. No such property, of course. Line 25 is not happy. Controller.list. So am I calling it list? Yeah. So controller.list, that's model. Expect model people.size, which is the model from here. So let's see what the error is. Does anybody see what the problem is? So line 25, mixing no such property contains. Pardon me. What is contains in this case?
Contains to controller. I don't know if you saved that file.
Let's find that out. Let me bring this back here. So, yeah, I did. So controller, so maybe it didn't pick up the change. Thank you. So controller.list, and then we are saying, give me the model. But I want this in the sorted order. How do I really check for the sorted order? So what I'm going to do for sorted order is, I'm going to get the model, and I'm going to check if its value is in the sorted order. I don't have to do an extensive check. All I want to do is, does this really make sense to have this particular value? So notice what I'm going to do here. I'm going to copy that for a minute. Test list returns in sorted order, right? So returns in sorted order. So in this case, what am I going to do? I got a model, and model, well, you see there are 4 in this model. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, it's sorting on the last name, so it appears like Raj is going to be on the top. So I'm going to say model 0 dot last name is really what we are looking for, right? It does not have to be a comprehensive check. So what's going to happen this time? It's going to complain to us, you're expecting Raj, but when I go to the model, is it model.person? So model.people square bracket, there we go, 0. So I can ask it what does it find? And how does this work? Well, it says on the results, the first one should be the one with the name Raj because of the sorting. Of course, this is going to fail because we haven't implemented the code yet. So you can go to the code and say, well, let's call this list for a minute, but this is going to list off, list ordered by, right? Name. Say that again for me. Order by first name. No, actually, did I have a last name rather? Order by last name. Yeah, by last name. Thank you. So list order by, right? Not order. Order by last name. Okay. So this is ensuring sorting. What else do I want to do? Well, what if you're trying to save a person? What should happen? Well, if you save a person, it should read. So let's take the sequence. You go to the save. Save was successful. What should it do? Yes, but how does it do that? What kind of command does it use? Redirect. Why does it do a redirect? Why not simply return you a populated list? Very good point. So because you could refresh it, and when you refresh it, you don't want the create to be called, save to be called again, right? Really good point. That's the reason why you want to do that. Your redirect will say, if you ever refresh, I'm going to display the result for you. I'm not going to go back and recreate the stuff for you, right? So it doesn't go back to it. That's really a good reason. That's the reason why you do this. Absolutely. So what am I going to do here? Well, the tests are passing. Let's go back to the code and say, hey code, let's say void test save redirects to list. So controller.save, but what am I really saving? Params.firstName is equal to, let's say, Jake. Params.lastName, so we'll say last name, equals whatever. And we have an email address, right? So params.email address equals. So now call the save. However, once we call save, what's going to happen? Expect. And then we're going to say, well, he's going to redirect. But what do I want him to redirect? I want him to redirect to the list. So I'm going to say in this case a person list, right? That's the location I want it to go to. So in the UI, so person list, and I'm going to put a little string around it, is equal to, and what is this going to be? Response dot redirected URL. But before that, is there anything else I need to check? That the save actually happened, so that's going to be a true once it happens. And oh, yes, one more. Person saved is equal to controller dot flash dot message, right? Of course, I don't have this code yet. It's going to fail. So while it's trying to fail, let's go write this. So I'm going to say define save. And what should I do here? Well, person equals new person params person.save, and once I save the person, flash dot message, actually it's going to be above this, so equals person saved, right? That's the message we wrote, person saved. Say that again?
Why is 10 above 12?
You should actually do it after the save, you're right. So 10 about 12, yeah, it should be this order, right? And then you say redirect to action list. So that is our code. We have to kind of have the idea of the code in our mind, think through that, right? Let's make sure the test passes. And then what is the next test? The next test is void test, and I'm going to say void test, let's say save failed. Why did it fail? Because I'm not going to give him any parameters. So controller.save expect, first problem, a person create. It should send me the create, right? Equal to view. And once it sends me to the create, what am I looking for in this case? So we know that value is the create. which is for the view. What about the flash message? That should be an error, isn't it? So I could say, oops, error saving equals controller dot flash dot message. So let's run this. The test is going to fail. Why? Because the way we implemented the save, it didn't care. But in this case, we're not sending in params. So that's going to fail, but it's still going to come back with that message. In fact, it's interesting to see the message actually. What does the message say? The message says, aha, you expected oops, error saving, but I got %saved. Makes sense, right? Because that's all we have written so far. And then I'm going to go back to this code and say, okay, thanks. But if person was able to save, then do the flash and do the redirect. If it's not, else, what should I do? Well, first of all, flash.message is equal to, what is the error message we wrote? Oops, error saving, right? So I'm going to say, oops, error saving. So that's what we're going to do here. And what is this going to be? Which one? Render or redirect? Render, right? Render. What am I rendering? View for the list. Right? Are we done? Not yet. So we are, sorry, view create, right? Create. So we asked him to view create. But there's one other problem. When you have a failure of a save, you're going to go back and display the create. Are you done? Are we missing something? Keep the data, right? If you don't, what happens? The user curses you, right? It's like, damn, I put all this data and you guys took it away, right? Becomes really painful. So preserving that state is very important. So to preserve the state, what are we going to do? We're going to pass the model to it, right? That's what we're going to do here. So one last test I'm going to write here. Oh, after the test passes, of course. Sorry, not before that. So what's the problem here? No such property create for the class. So let's go back here. He says he doesn't know what create means. What line number he's complaining about. So he's complaining on line number, what is the line number here? Okay, so missing property, no such property, create for class person controller, and it's probably about the save. So let's go ahead and fix that. So back here in the test, it says save controller.save. Wait a minute, where's this code? So person params person.save. This is going to be list, otherwise this is going to be create. There we go. It's going to be a create string. We don't need the create method for this test to pass because the render is not going to do the work right now. It simply says render it and Grails will take and do that, but in the test it's not going to do that. So, it's good so far? So one last test, if this test passes of course, not otherwise, what should we do? Well, I want to send the data for him to do properly, right? So what are we going to do for the data? So we're going to say the last test here is void test failed to save. Let's look at this one more time. It doesn't want to still pass. So give me a second. So what we're going to do while it's doing, let's talk about this. So test failed, what does it do? Failed to save is going to give me the sense a model to create. So what should I do here? Controller.save And I'm going to say, in this case, expect. And what does this say in this case? Actually, I'll come back to that in a minute because I need to make the other one pass. So let's come back to that. So, all right. So why is it failing at this point? What am I doing wrong? So, oops, error saving, and then controller.flash.message, and then person create. Is it person create? That's probably the reason why it's not happy. We'll find out what it tells us. That will be a good indication to see what it's giving us. There we go. It says person/create is the view. Person/create is that. What's the difference between those two? It's a false. /. Aha. So that's the reason. Thank you. Sorry?
Either you have it or you don't have it.
Yeah. So let's go to the specification and you provide that. You're right. Great. So now let's go to the very final test. Hopefully this is final test. So what are we going to do here? Well, void test failed save model send model to create. So this says I'm going to call save. It's a failed test, no doubt about it. So what should we do within the failed test? Well, the failed test says I'm going to go save, and if that failed, I want to make sure that null not equal to model.people. Model.person. I need to make sure I pass that data to you. So if I save that, it's going to fail. I'll wait for it to fail. Then I'm going to say comma model. I'm not saved this yet. And then I'm going to say person, colon, and this is going to be the person we just tried to save. The one that failed saving, right? That's what we want to send to this guy. So that's the last test here, is to just say, send this out. So the test failed. Let's go add that code, and that does it. So I find that it's really hard to write these tests when I have no clue. But when I think about this, I often tend to modularize this code also, right, rather than just plugging through, and that becomes a lot easier to work with. So that's a control level test. What about the view level test? Well, we are checking to see if we are actually talking to the right view. So oftentimes what I do here is to make sure that the view data that I'm getting is actually the right data that I'm getting. So that kind of helps me to know that I'm talking to the view. And you can of course use things like Selenium or Jeb on top of this using Spark, and then you can do a UI level testing if that makes sense, but keep it very minimum, like I said. So that's basically what you're seeing here, is you can actually start test driving it. We saw some of these features where we use the mock, we use the domain object. I think we did pretty much all of these. You could even set the form content type if you want to set the content type for being a data form, but in this case it worked even without it. So questions, comments before we wrap it up? I am so glad, because when you started the question, I was saying, oh dear, but you twisted the question right in the middle. I'm impressed. Because usually what people ask me is, how do I motivate others? You're a very smart man. You asked, how do I motivate ourselves? Hats off to you. Thank you. Well, the first motivation to me is this. I love writing code. However, I take pride in releasing software that actually works. I want to come back and add more features. I didn't do TDD all my life. No, not at all. But over the years, I've gotten better at it. And in the recent projects I worked on, for a client I did this work, where it was a very complex multi-threaded code. I did it entirely test-driven. And when I did, we found errors. We were able to fix it very quickly. And I moved away from the project. I got an email from the client saying something is broken. I said, I'm really sorry, I'm busy. I don't have time today, but I can look at it over the weekend. But if you can write a test for me, because we had a lot of tests, I said, if you can write a test for me, then I can tell you, I can look at it. So the client went on to write a test, and the minute he wrote a test, he said, this has given me so much clarity. He went on to fix the problem. He said, thanks, I don't need your help. I fixed it. And I want this kind of projects where I don't have to be babysitting the code, right? So in other words, let me change this a little bit, right? So this is where I want you to think of the word professionalism. So, do you have children? I didn't ask you whether you're married. I just asked you if you have children. No, not yet. Okay. All right. Okay. So, just kidding. So, so you have little cousins. Yeah, absolutely, right? Niece, nephews. Yeah. So, they are definitely dear ones, right? You care about them. Moms, uncles, right? So, you take them to the doctor. When you take them to the doctor, and I've got children, and nothing is more important to me than my children, I take them to the doctor, then what do I expect now from the doctor? I want the doctor to be an extreme professional. I don't want the doctor to do stuff, fishy stuff to make money. They need to really put my children's health in the forefront, right? And so what do I expect the doctor to do? I expect the doctor to clean their hands properly, use a good sanitization process, use the right kind of medicines, not overdose, underdose, read up, keep up to date. That's professionalism, right? When your employer comes to you and says, could you please do this? It's your professionalism to say, well, you know what, I could do it this way, or I can do it this way, it's going to save cost for you and me, right? That's one thing. Second problem, this is one of the biggest problems we see. Most of us who write software do not pay for the software that we are writing, right? So here's the unfortunate thing. If you come and write code for me, I pay you. And if you write a poor code, what am I going to do? I'm going to pay you more to fix it. And you're thinking, why should I write a better code when I can get paid twice for the same thing, right? You wouldn't think about it, I'm not suggesting you do, but as a professional we would say, no, that's not right for me to do. Unfortunately, that's not the industry we're in. But add that to the fact that as a manager I come to you and say, I don't have time for you. I got a release, finish it now. Well, it takes enormous courage for you to stand up to me and say, I'm really sorry, but that's not professional of me, I'm not going to do it. So in other words, we have to really put emphasis on being professional. I pay for software I create these days. I'm here speaking to you. This entire week, what am I doing? I'm here in front of you. If my software fails, there are only two options. I'm going to go back to the hotel tonight and start fixing it. You know what? I work very late in the night and early in the mornings. I would rather do new code than fix my own bugs. Or alternately, I wrote a messy code. I can hire you, pay you money to come and fix the mess I created. Or I can take a little bit more time and say, let me create better quality with test so I don't have to do it. As an example, on a Saturday morning, right about 5 o'clock, I get an email from somebody who said, you know what, I'm using your application. It would be so much nice if you just provided this one feature. That's it. This is a 5 a.m. email on Saturday. I look at this and say, you know what, that would be really nice, isn't it? And by 6 a.m., unit tested fully, deployed, I send an email back to him saying, could you please give it a try? Within an hour, he was in Europe, I was in the US, it's a daytime for him. Within an hour he sends back saying, hey, this is awesome, exactly what I wanted, and I'm so thrilled you gave it to me so fast. I cannot imagine making a production release within minutes if I did not have automated tests. And so when you start doing this, my recommendation is this. Don't try to motivate yourselves by saying it's all or nothing. We cannot handle that. But lay in front of you these little things that give you micro successes. We really thrive on micro successes, right? And then you succeed and succeed, and then your mind really feeds that success taste, right? Oh, you know what, if I've done these many things so well, I can get to the next level. But instead, if you try to say, I'm going to have 100% test coverage from tomorrow, well, we plop, fail. And then it's like, oh, you know what, I don't think I can ever get these things. So always feed your mind little bits of success. We're all mental, really mental, right? We thrive on these kinds of feedback loops. So you give a little thing to succeed, you succeed that, your mind says, you know what, that's great, I can do it. Now I can take a little bit more. And then we become really good at doing TDD after that. So that's a way to motivate ourselves. Tell yourselves, why should you use it? Why you're a professional doing it? What is a payback for you? You're able to write better quality code. You don't have to sit at work and fix the stupid code we wrote. We can focus more on releasing more features. I become a better person. I can get a better job. When I become a manager, lead a project team, I can motivate my team to look at all these cumulative benefits, and you're like, wow, that's a much better place to be than where I am. I'm going to change from tomorrow, right? This is true about everything else we do. You know what, I should really exercise. Well, you know what, you wake up in the morning, I don't want to even get out of the bed. Oh, I would rather have a cup of coffee and sit here and relax. I don't want to really go exercise. Oh, I got this book to write, I got this article to write, I got to this. And then you are like dragging your feet, right? And then you cut that thought and say, if I don't exercise, I put on weight. If I don't exercise, I'm beginning to hurt on my back. If I don't exercise, all these things that don't work properly, and then slowly your body moves a little bit, you get up, and you put on your shoes, and you step out, and you're like, wow. So this is called inertia, right? The really most difficult thing for us to do is break the inertia. But the minute we break the inertia, things begin to flow. This is again, they say when you want to go work out, have a nice friend who walks up in the morning, knock on your door at 5:30, hey, let's go. Oh, this idiot is again at my door. But I cannot say no to him again 2 times in a row. I'm going to go with him. Same thing with TDD, pair up with somebody. And you pair up with somebody and say, hey, I want to do this, do you want to do it? Now there's a peer pressure, right? You can pair up and say, all right, I'm not motivated enough to do, you're not motivated to do, but we both are going to kind of support each other. That's another way to do that. That can help quite a bit also. It's a good question, excellent question.
Yeah, yeah, right. So I'm 1 year here.
Yeah.
So first I started like having first code then writing a selector. When I read somewhere that TDD is better than the other approach.
Yeah.
So I started writing in that TDD.
Yes, sir.
But it becomes so difficult for me to do it in that way. Sometimes I got frustrated. So I thought anyway I'm coding 100% all my code with this code base. So why go there?
If it's frustrating, that means you're doing it right. And the reason I say that is, do you remember the very first day you sat on a bicycle? Right? You do ride a bicycle, right? You don't have to be having children to ride a bicycle, right? Okay. So you start riding a bicycle. Remember that day how frustrating it was? And you probably had a elder cousin or a friend run with you on the bicycle in the back. When I was trying to teach my son bicycling, I didn't really teach him a whole lot. I was not around so much. But one day I remember my wife said, why don't you go teach him bicycling? So I run with him. He says, Daddy, I will never learn bicycling. I said, oh my God, that's a very, very poor statement. Why do you say that? He said, because look at you, you had to keep running behind me. Oh no, don't worry about it, you learn. As I was saying it, I let go, and he didn't even realize it, right? TDD is a skill. TDD is a skill, and when you start on any skill, it's very difficult for us. But once you get comfortable in the skill, you get better at it. You're going to learn techniques along the way. It was extremely hard for me to write tests in the beginning. I would say it takes anywhere from 6 months to maybe 2 years. It's a steep learning curve. But if you stay at it, but here's the problem, right? You try it for 2 months, and then you don't do it, and then you come back. Unlike learning bicycle, it doesn't stay with you, right? It takes a step backward. You got to stay with it as well. That becomes necessary. Yeah. Well, that's all I have. You've been a very patient group, so thank you for your time. Thanks for your interest. I'll hope to see you tomorrow if you're around. Thank you. Yeah.